Alrighty. So as you were, I'm sure, just notified on your screens, this webinar is being recorded, and I will share a little bit more on that in just a moment. Alrighty. Well, it looks like we have a good number of attendees already with us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started since we are at noon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I am pleased to share that our friends of MAPC, Dr. Jenny Schuetz and Shae Strait, are here to present rural housing and climate risk challenges for this month's webinar. I will further introduce our speakers in just a moment, but I just wanted to quickly run through some logistical items and just some general information. So the CM number for this webinar is listed here. I'll also share that in the chat momentarily. It should be certified for 1.5 credits, as this is an hour-and-a-half long webinar. So we really do encourage questions, and we'll have a good bit of time at the end of this webinar to have an open discussion. So please submit your questions through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. That will just help us keep track of all inquiries. But if there's ever an opportunity during that Q&A towards the end in which there's an opportunity for open-ended discussion, feel free to use the chat box. I will keep that enabled, and feel free to use the chat box by direct messaging me if you have any logistical questions. And during that formal Q&A, you can, of course, use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted to ask your question out loud. But otherwise, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. I will also be sharing in the chat box a link to the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration website page, which is on the APA Virginia chapter website, where you can find information about this collaboration and other upcoming webinars. I will note that the Your Hour with APA Virginia webinar series will not have a webinar at the end of this month because we will all be in Portsmouth for our annual conference. And I know the Virginia team is looking forward to that. I will just do a quick plug to announce that our early bird rates are closing tomorrow, the 3rd. So please take advantage of those discounted rates. Get your registration in now, and we are looking forward to seeing you in Portsmouth. One last thing before I further introduce our speakers. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared to the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration YouTube page. I'll link that in the chat as well, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware that this is a recorded webinar. Alrighty, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Allow our speakers to throw up their slide decks while I introduce them a little bit more. So Dr. Jenny Schuetz leads Arnold Ventures' infrastructure portfolio for housing. In this role, she oversees AV's efforts to identify and enact policies that can successfully expand housing supply and make it easier to build more and different types of housing. Jenny came to Arnold Ventures with more than 25 years of experience in housing policy as a professor, economist, and author. She is a prolific writer on housing markets and authored the book Fixer Upper: How to Repair Americans' Broken Housing Systems. Prior to joining AV, she was a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and an adjunct lecturer in the Urban and Regional Planning program at Georgetown University. She previously worked as an economist of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, as a professor at the University of Southern California and City College of New York, and as a senior research affiliate at New York University, she began her career at ABT Associates Incorporated. She received a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a bachelor's in economics and political science and social thought from the University of Virginia. Shae Strait, Director of Planning and Development for Fairmont, West Virginia, has served the state and its communities for over 15 years. Shae served for 6 years as the technical engineer in the West Virginia Army National Guard, building civil infrastructure as a technical assistant provider at the Brownfield Assistance Center at WVU through the BAD Buildings Program, and has written over a dozen redevelopment plans for the communities across the state, including numerous strategic and comprehensive plans, as well as the Charleston West Side redevelopment plan in 2018. Shae has served as a city planner in Huntington and now serves as the Director of Planning and Development in Fairmont. Shae has a bachelor's and master's degree from Fairmont State University in architecture. The master's program focused on Appalachian small town revitalization and urban planning, in which students learn to use design to help communities succeed. So we have two wonderful speakers with just a wealth of knowledge with us this afternoon. So I'm looking forward to this presentation, and thank you everybody for joining.
And thank you so much for inviting me to join. Is everybody able to see my slides?
We
Yes.
can see them, Jenny. I just wanted to let you know that it looks like it is not in full screen mode just quite yet.
All right.
There we go. Perfect.
Excellent. Thanks so much. It's great to be with all of you today virtually. Hope you're getting ready for an exciting 4th of July weekend, or not exciting, whichever floats your boat. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of national context on what some of the climate challenges are facing our homes and our neighborhoods, and the ways that particularly local governments, but policymakers at all levels of government can help protect people and neighborhoods. I don't need to tell any of you how much we face not just physical threats, but also financial threats from extreme weather and natural disasters ranging across the country. And we'll point out that often the ones that wind up being most dangerous and most costly are the kinds of extreme weather events that we're not used to. One of the things that we're noticing is that weather patterns are changing. And so often the buildings and the infrastructure in one region of the country are not used to the types of events that are happening. So the South is used to heat, the South is less used to winter storms that can cause pipes to freeze and to burst. And so part of what we need to do is just be aware of and be ready for a wider range of events that will happen. Just to give sort of a broad overview of the kinds of events that communities across the country are dealing with, you can see that the relative highest risk for different kinds of events varies a lot geographically. Large swaths of the middle of the country, water stress or drought as one of the major events. Obviously, the Mid-Atlantic region is extremely diverse geographically, and so depending on where you're located, it may be extreme rainfall, it may be from wind damage from hurricanes, it may be sea level rise, it may be extreme heat, and it may be a combination of those at different types of the year. If we zoom in a little bit more closely, you can see some of the geographic variation at small areas. So this is a map that shows us the difference in average home insurance premiums. And you can see that even within relatively small distances, this varies quite a lot. So insurance premiums costs have been going up quite a bit in most parts of the country. Coverage has become more difficult to get in some cases. Within the Mid-Atlantic region, this is particularly acute for some of the coastal areas that are subject to both flooding from sea level rise and from intense storms. But you can see that some of the inland areas also have higher insurance premiums. And Shae is, I know, going to talk some about some of the communities that he works in. Many of the mountain communities are also seeing damages from flooding as well. One of the things to keep in mind when we talk about insurance markets is that although the underlying physical risk doesn't stop at geographic boundaries, insurance markets are regulated at the state level by state insurance commissions. And so that makes quite a bit of difference in both the pricing and the availability of both private market insurance, and then of course the availability of state fair share plans. So here we can see, for instance, non-renewal rates of insurance policies are substantially higher in North Carolina than South Carolina, even right across the border. I'm not an expert in either of these states' insurance markets and what they're doing, but this sort of discontinuity is a suggestion that there may be something on the prices they're able to be charged or the availability of alternative plans that are offered by the public sector. So the state governments in particular are really important in regulating insurance rates, and there's a real trade-off between keeping the annual premiums affordable to property owners, but that tends to then provide less reimbursement for the insurance companies, which over the long term winds up leading many of the private insurers to pull out of the market altogether. So there's a real tension there in the availability and the cost to households. The good news is there's actually quite a range of policies available at all levels of government that can help households and businesses and communities be more resilient in advance of disasters, which is clearly what we want to be doing more than just dealing with the recovery after the fact. So if we think about sort of the ways in which policymakers can influence property owners' behavior, households' behavior, businesses' behavior, there are at least sort of four big categories. One is through mortgage and insurance markets. Another is through land use planning, zoning, and development regulation, which of course is key to what planners are doing in cities and counties. Regulating housing construction quality through things like building codes and retrofits. And then all of the investments that we're making in local infrastructure, in making our roads, our sidewalks, our water and sewer systems more resilient. There's also quite a range in the type of interventions that can be provided and the cost of doing those. So for instance, across all of these categories of intervention, providing people with better information about what risks they face, what kinds of physical investments in homes and infrastructure will make them more resilient, will make them safer. The information sharing is often the cheapest and the easiest thing to do. And fortunately, we are getting much better small scale climate risk data, which then allows people to plan in advance for what they need to do. So we're getting better about producing this. Many of the private companies that provide this data are getting better and better resolution and better forecasting, which allows people to make better plans. I will say that it's sometimes challenging to understand what to do with this data. And a piece that I feel like we haven't done a great job of so far is telling people what they can do in response to this. So just telling them that they are at risk for flooding is not that helpful unless we tell them the kinds of hardening investments they can make to homes, how much they should pay for it, what are the contractors in your area that can do this kind of work, and helping people have access to resources in order to do this. So sort of providing information and connecting the dots from the risk to the interventions and then how to actually undertake this and pay for it. This is a really key role for local governments, and planners have an incredibly important role in helping particularly people find access to resources, financial resources, and to information. I will say that when we get into other things like using regulations as a stick, blocking new development in high-risk locations, these are going to encounter a lot more political resistance and really require a number of strategies to make this work. So just knowing the full range of tools that are available and realizing that not one of these alone is going to do the job, we need to access the full range of tools to make people safer. I like often to remind people that there are two sides to the coin. We want to have fewer homes built in the highest risk areas going forward. And the only way we can do that while still enabling growth is to make sure that we're building as many homes as we can in neighborhoods that are relatively climate safe, and that we are building new homes in resilient ways. And so making sure that people have places to live, that we have affordable housing at all price points and rent points in safer communities has to be a part of the solution. One of the things that we sort of go back and forth on is how much of the responsibility for making homes and neighborhoods resilient falls on individual property owners, whether that's homeowners or business owners, and how much should be borne by the community. And I think it's worth just stepping back and thinking about some examples where really the neighborhood level strategies are going to make things easier and safer for people living in a community and for people who work in a community or use the space but don't live there all the time. Since we're in the summer, it's fun to talk about what do we do about heat. I don't know about the rest of you how you get to work, but I take the bus every day, and my bus stop is on the wrong side of the street, so we get full sun in both the morning and in the afternoon. And one of the easiest things that communities can do is just make sure that transit stops have adequate shade, and so that people who are waiting for their buses or their trains have some place to wait that is not as hot. And things like providing seats for people to sit down on, or misters. So a lot of the investments that we actually want to make around extreme heat and around a number of other interventions is really making the physical environment, the public space, the shared space more resilient, which is not something that we can ask individual households and property owners to do. And again, this is just intended to show kind of the range of things, in addition to things like shade, providing some water functions at things like parks. Kids running through water fountains is not just fun, this also helps people stay cool, providing neighborhood cooling centers at schools, at libraries, for people who don't have access to air conditioning or don't have the means to run that. And then investments in the buildings themselves, whether that's green roofs, taking out some of the pavement and putting in permeable surfaces and green spaces that can absorb the sunlight without radiating back heat. So we really have a very wide range of tools to undertake at the neighborhood level. The more we provide cooling for entire neighborhoods, the less we are putting the financial burden on individual homeowners to run their air conditioning and pay those utility bills. And so this needs to be a collaborative effort. We spend a lot of time thinking about sort of how you divide up the responsibility for these policy interventions between local, state, federal agencies. There are roles for all of them. And so thinking about what can be done sort of more economically at larger scale entities. I mentioned that we are getting better and better locally geographic climate risk data that enables planning down to the parcel level, to the neighborhood level, but this is often quite expensive to buy a subscription. The data can be complicated to work with, and so you have to have GIS capacity and sort of large-scale computer use in order to do this. That makes this more appropriate for regional governments, say the COG, or state governments, to take the lead in purchasing a subscription, doing the analysis, and then sharing the results in an actionable way with local governments, but not requiring everyone to duplicate this sort of work up front. Local governments all need to be developing their own resilience and adaptation plans. What are you planning to do with your transit systems, with your parks, with your schools? Where are you planning to make investments in your infrastructure resilience? And of course, local governments need to be talking with their neighbors because we know that the physical risks don't stop at these geographic boundaries or these political boundaries. And so making sure that you're coordinating to have plans that match up across this. I will say one of the challenges that I think many of us in this space wrestle with is that talking to people who are not technical experts about climate risk can be very hard. For those of you who've spent time looking at things like flood risk data, the measurements come in things like the probability of flooding for the 100-year flood or the 500-year flood, or the expected depth of flood waters. This isn't an intuitive way to communicate to people whether they are at relatively higher or lower risk. And it certainly doesn't help them understand what they can do. And so I think all of us who work in this sort of public space need to be thinking about how to provide the information in a way that motivates people without scaring them, that provides them with specific strategies and steps that they can take that are actually feasible. Telling people that the world is going to crash down on their heads without giving them the tools to make things better just winds up being counterproductive. And I know that there's some political sensitivity sometimes talking about climate change, but in every part of the country, people know that there are current threats from weather events and disasters. And so sometimes just the language that we use to talk about this can make this easier to get people to hear you talking about these very specific sort of neighborhood and community level risks, and also tools to make this better, makes this feel less abstract and more something that we can actually do something about, particularly if we all work together, because we know that this is a community level threat and is only going to be manageable if we work together as communities. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to Shae's comments.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Go ahead and share my presentation here. So Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of a more kind of focused discussion here because especially within my community and where I work as a professional planner here in West Virginia, we do face some unique challenges within our rural settings around housing and climate change. Um, so just to start out, as Jenny mentioned, we can look at these models and we can see what the higher risks are. And as you saw, extreme rain events, so flooding is a concern for us, as well as wildfires is another increased risk here. And this applies generally to all of Central Appalachia. So many of our mid-Atlantic states here face the same risks and have similar challenges because of our topography and our climate, and then the climate changes coming. But we can see there where West Virginia kind of ranks and looks at that across the community, especially the southern part of the state. I just want to draw attention to that. You'll see on the left with the wildfires, the increased risk down there for them, and not as much here in North Central or our panhandles as we get near Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. The other thing we got to keep in mind, although they're not climate related, but it does tie into it, is with many Appalachian communities, of course, mining subsidence is a problem. And so this is the underground surface mapping that is available here in West Virginia or where coal seams have been mined out. So we can look at that. We can look at the risks to communities or even individual properties. And a lot of these mine maps are now available publicly. And that ties into it, especially with our topography, because this water has to have somewhere to go. And we all know, for those of us who do floodplain management and how hydrology works, water wants to get to those negative air spaces. And so mines create an additional risk when we're talking about climate change and flooding. With West Virginia, you may not think of our state as something in particular, or Central Appalachian generally, as having housing issues in terms of housing shortages, but surprisingly we do. And the reason you may not assume that is because if you've seen in the news, West Virginia is one of the few states that is declining in population overall rather than growing. We're not the only one, but we are one of two states that have been doing that consistently. So you can see here, this map kind of shows both the increases and decreases across counties here in West Virginia. I just want to once again draw attention, especially to southwestern part of our state there, McDowell County, Logan, Mingo, Wyoming, Boone, and so forth, and the population loss that they have faced. You can see that's in the thousands. When we look at actual populations too, currently of those counties, you can also see that it is disproportionate across the state, and mostly our urbanized areas obviously have higher populations. We don't have the lowest populated counties in the Appalachian region. Even when you go over into Virginia there, you'll see counties up against our state line that have even smaller numbers than we do for total population. But what this is meant to showcase is, with less population, also less economy generally, those governments and just even local communities will have less resources available. They're going to have less fees and revenues and taxes to address this as governments, but there'll be a smaller number of persons as well that'll be able to contribute and to be able to work on these problems that these communities face. And this is particularly concerning for the rural communities. With the last housing needs assessment that was conducted in West Virginia, just to look at that, was done in 2019. So we all know the landscape has changed since then with the pandemic, and the housing market has taken huge turns. But a lot of this data still holds true. What we're hearing from our local communities and other professional planners, there are still drastic shortages of housing across the board for owner-occupied rentals, and particularly for our senior population here in West Virginia, as we in Central Appalachia, as we suffer from that. So we can see here, red is bad on that chart. I'm sure you can't see the smaller numbers, but every county pretty much across the board, both at the time and predicted in the future, had shortages of adequate housing and at all affordability levels. The other thing we need to consider here with the housing challenges we face in the region is that the age of the housing. So when we look at that, and also the quality level, and don't mind the anomalies, you notice like on the 10 years there in the mid-century, there's huge spikes. That's just because they guessed the age of the house when they created this data, and they didn't know, they just stuck it to a decade. But we can see as homes were built across the entire state. And then what we see in the bottom chart there is the quality level of original construction. This is important because as we talk about these housing issues and climate change, lower quality initial construction will often be more prone to severe damage or be more difficult to maintain going forward. And what we look at is, if you think in West Virginia, the way we rate these, a C is going to be your average kind of 1980s, 1985 home of standard construction quality with good HVAC systems and wall subassemblies and roof and so forth. And then anything below that would be something that would either be built earlier and also not to a higher quality standard. And as you can see, West Virginia in particular doesn't begin to see substantial percentages of higher quality construction to really start to come out until right around 1980. And then about 5-10 years after 1980, around 1990, we start to see that increase again. I feel like we're always a decade behind. That's really important also because then that takes into account maintenance. Often older homes have much higher chance, often 2 to 3 times the rate of repairs that are needed, whether that's for their roof or foundation, walls, floors, and so forth, plumbing, electrical. And so homes built before and after 1980 is a really great threshold to kind of measure that. As we saw in the previous slides, this region has a lot of homes that are much older and were often lower quality construction when they were initially built. This is especially true also for coal camp communities. We still have a lot of those, especially in our rural areas, where these were often, wood frame, light wood frame construction, and they were very quick, just went up. Some don't even have foundations. They just sit directly on the soil. So that's not as common, but that did happen with a lot of these coal camp communities. And so the quality levels are real low, and these are the homes that are still here and available in the market in these rural communities. We can also look at that if there's disproportionate numbers with that across those regions. Normally, if you'll see the green, which is better, the newer housing, we're looking at 1980 onward or prior, being the orange and reds, then we can see that this is also disproportionate to the rural regions or the older regions that had early resource extraction economies here. Once again, drawing particular attention to the southern half of the state, where you can see down in McDowell County that the average year for the home built was 1937. And even in some of our more urbanized areas like Harrison and Marion County, we're looking at 1949 and 1951, which means based on this, housing is often not only lower quality, it's going to be much older and more financially difficult to maintain. And this is looking at those quality levels. It's not even across the board as well. Usually the rural areas will have lower quality initial construction, likely some of those coal camp communities contributing to those types of numbers, as well as lack of a regulatory environment. So we can also see with that, now when we start talking about climate change and flood risk, especially for here, and our flood risk is flash flooding. If you're unfamiliar, if you're not within the hills or the deeper part of Appalachia, the flash flooding that comes down through our draws and our valleys very quickly. We can also see the comparison where often the middle and lower quality grade of housing is more likely to be located in a high risk area for flood. So that means, once again, compounding these housing issues for our existing residents. And when we look at that, the high risk versus moderate and low risk for floods across the counties here in West Virginia, once again, those higher bars are those more rural areas. So southern coal country here in West Virginia up against Kentucky and Virginia. So Logan, Lincoln, McDowell, Mingo counties. Some have rates like McDowell there of nearly 50% of homes, single family homes, are at high risk of flood. And this is based upon the 100-year flood data. This is an example of just kind of one of those communities looking at our statewide floodplain map. This is Caldwell, just outside of White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, if you're familiar with that area, in Lewisburg. Beautiful region. And so Caldwell here is an unincorporated community. And we can clearly see, you can see the white outlines, hopefully, in the map of many of those homes being within the 100-year floodplain. And we can also see some of our topography there. And so part of the challenge we have is that the reason this high percentage of homes in Central Appalachia is located in the floodplain is because those were the more buildable areas, and honestly, it also follows the pattern of development where most of our human civilizations are built around water. This is also where we could put the roads and the resources and the businesses and so forth. And it is very challenging to relocate that, to change the roads, to create new housing developments and new communities because of the substantial topographic challenges that these communities face in and around them. So this is now zooming out. Caldwell there on the left, White Sulphur Springs there on the right, and you can just see how many ridges, draws, and spurs there are across that region to create those challenges. So with the rural environment and with the declining population, but yet still existing residents that we want to make sure have fair, adequate, and safe housing, we need to talk about, well, who can help address these challenges and these socioeconomically distressed regions. When we look at West Virginia, we do have very small urban environments. And even with our top 14 cities here, we can see some of them have higher percentages. Those usually be the Ohio River Valley or Kanawha River Valley. And many of those have flood walls, luckily for them, to protect their communities. Not all do, and they'll have the higher numbers. But as you can see, once again, if we compare that to the rural counties, there aren't larger municipal governments which may have access to resources or be willing politically to enact regulations to help protect and ensure residents are safe, and new development is supporting that as well. Real quick, I want to draw particular attention to my community here, Fairmont. We actually have one of the lowest rates in the entire state for a number of single-family homes that are at risk, at a high flood risk. So, but that draws to attention to the climate change part. Here is a floodplain map of our community. So we are an urbanized area. We have one of the highest per capita median incomes for a county as well as city. And we are unique in the way that our community generally sits about 100 to 120 feet in elevation above our rivers. We are the beginning of the Monongahela River that goes to Pittsburgh. And we have the West Fork and the Tigard River as well. And nearly all of our neighborhoods are pretty high above those areas. And so that's why when you look at our floodplain map, barely anything that is developed is within the floodplain. And with our community, though, what adds that challenge, and this is for a lot of our developed areas in West Virginia, is when you look at mine subsidence, you can see the rivers here. You can kind of see those real light gray lines, hopefully, that go through here, and you can see the lack of mines along them. Usually we did not mine under the water, the moving water here. And so you can see where pretty much every square foot of land is undermined here within our community. But what's also important about this is these maps weren't well maintained, and they were mandated in 1883, but they weren't mandated to be maintained. So a lot were lost, and we have thousands of coal mines that are unmapped. So even though you may look at a map like this and you go, oh, okay, well, a community like this should build on the eastern side of the Monongahela River because there's not, underground mining, and so less risk of that subsidence or sinkholes. And it's not even actually the case. The east side of the Mon River is undermined. It's just that a lot of this was lost in time, and so it has not been mapped. Or by the time in 1968 that these companies were mandated, if they had these mines, to go back and remap them for whatever reasons may trigger that, you'll often see they would have mapped these only to where they encountered water and then stopped their mapping. So actually many of these mines are much deeper and go much farther distances than are even actually mapped if they are. So if we zoom back in, we're looking here, this is called Coal Run. So there's a stream here. We can see a little bit on the right-hand side of a 100-year floodplain. And this is, well over 100 feet above our river, the Monongahela River. And I want to draw particular attention to way off on the left-hand side, I've drawn a red box there around a couple buildings. So as you can see, this is well outside a 100-year floodplain, although it is in a low-lying area that used to be a stream that has been buried and is now a box culvert. And we have our substantial development. Right across the street from that red box is Fairmont State University, which is core to our community and our economy. So even though this building here is well outside a 100-year floodplain, For folks who may not have seen in the news, just a few weeks ago on Father's Day, Fairmont, West Virginia did suffer a substantial and devastating flood. And this is that same building that we just had the red box around. The image on the right is moments after the building had collapsed due to hydrostatic pressure that built up as the building filled with water from a 500-year rain event. And this event, as best as we can tell from light or radar data, is that it occurred very specifically in a few draws and valleys and a line across our community. And with the 500-year rate, we got about 3.27 inches in less than 60 minutes. And then even 4 inches in less than an hour in other locations as well that were luckily less developed. But here we can see a 3-story apartment building that unfortunately collapsed. And this was not something that we were intending to regulate because it was well outside the 100-year. And we had large box culverts and other stormwater infrastructure to try to mitigate these type of stormwater hazards. But as these extreme events increase and their likelihood, and this continues to be the case, we may have to change our discussion around this in these types of regions. And we may have to look at both our increasing 500-year hydrology studies and floodplain regulations, which is not as common here in West Virginia. There are places that have it, but it's not something that's regular, and even 1,000-year events. The other community I mentioned before, Caldwell, West Virginia, and White Sulphur Springs did suffer a 1 in 1,000 year event, and in 2016, and had a significant loss of life and also infrastructure and improvements across those communities, with Caldwell nearly being entirely wiped out, even though it's in a 100-year floodplain and it should have been mostly mucking and so forth. With 1,000-year event, it actually fully removed structures, roads, bridges, and just whole communities were unfortunately lost and within just a couple hours. So here we can see that. So what's our solution then when we're talking about these rural regions, right? Regulatory solutions may not be as politically viable. With these communities, they're often not receptive. These are going to take, if we are going to do that, it's going to take these big conversations. It's going to take a lot of time to work with these areas. And it's going to be difficult because they are remote, they are rural, and they often even don't have even smaller governments like our city. We're the 7th biggest city in West Virginia, but only 18,000 people. So when we're talking Wyoming, Mingo, Logan, McDowell County, and so forth, their communities are several hundred, often municipalities, and county government and their counties usually have populations as big as our cities. So the resources are much limited as well. So really what we should be looking at, especially in these types of challenges, to ensure that residents are not only safe, but we're trying to support them to continue having adequate, safe housing that's affordable, is looking at regional approaches. So anybody in the ARC region, you'll have your regional planning councils, and those are a great solution. So this is a map of West Virginia. And that's important because when we also look at trying to relocate, potentially like talking about those types of solutions and getting people into better affordable housing that are at high risk of flood or wildfire, many of these counties actually don't have resources that would support their needs of these communities. So some may not have hospitals or access to good quality libraries and school systems and so forth. But on a regional basis, that is true. And so the regions should be able to work on this and be able to help create plans to be able to tackle those challenges. Along with that, of course, the long-term planning part, these conversations in a rural environment are really going to take some time. And they're also going to take really big picture, really broad collaboration. The counties and cities and regional planning councils would have to work together in this type of environment. The right sizing is a potential discussion, although never popular in a rural setting. So talking about, potentially relocating entire communities worth of people, it's very difficult, especially as you break those social networks and those bonds that they rely on, borrowing a lawnmower or getting a little bit of food from a neighbor in order to support themselves and their family. And then as you relocate folks, that always strains those and their support network as well. It's also really hard because as we, even talk about relocating individuals at high risk, say like McDowell County, then it's harder to get the same level of affordability, although higher quality, much safer housing, but the affordability part becomes a big issue. So where it's viable, larger housing rehab and preservation programs. These are communities that usually their region planning and development councils will get CDBG funds, which are often used for home repair programs and so forth for low-income individuals. But majority of these regions, if you look at their budgets and you look at their projects, they're spending this money mostly on actual infrastructure, water, sewer, and so forth, because those are the big struggles. They're loss of population, lack of economy, and it's becoming much, much more difficult to maintain that infrastructure to support those communities. So majority of the money in that sense already goes there. So we would have to talk about either redistributing those funds and those projects along with, looking at where would be best for doing that. And that would all be based on a regional and local decisions. And then also looking at regional and state land banking, I think is really important. So if we're talking about like with right sizing potential government takings, which is something that has happened here in West Virginia, we've gone in and actually taken out entire communities due to mine subsidence or flooding even in the past. The state has not done that in the last few decades, but it has done it before. And so as you do that, this is something where that land could be held by the state as a land bank and preserved maybe for future conservation. Outdoor recreation is a big part of our future economy here in Central Appalachia. So being able to hold that land in public trust and be able to keep that perpetuity that way, but also leave it flexible with land banking so that if there is opportunity to do something with it in the future, something changes, that would be available. And also using the land banks to acquire the property regionally for preferred development areas for relocation if right sizing does occur. Code enforcement is a very scary word in many of our communities, along with any type of regulations. Very few of our counties even have subdivision and land use laws. And I'm sure it's the same in many other Appalachian counties and regions. And historic preservation then also becomes a challenge as well, because there's nobody either providing funds and services or mandating those types of things as well. So more of that is needed because although code enforcement can be seen as a burden on the property owner, good, well done, and context-based code enforcement to support people to try to encourage them to preserve their housing and keep it at a quality level to keep them safe is always better. The longer maintenance goes deferred, the higher the cost eventually will be for those improvements, placing further burden on those socioeconomically distressed homeowners and renters. And then also regional conservation planning is a big part of this, talking about and matching that with floodplain regulations. So looking at river and stream restoration, including outside the actual floodplain boundaries. And that could be looking at things like expanded conservation of riparian zones or the mixed and upland zones there in order to handle higher water volumes. In other words, we let it flood just over the riverbanks, right, and the stream banks. Fairmont, for example, we have 100 feet. So we require between 50 to 100 feet from a riverbank to be preserved. And that is so that we have that area for overflow in the event of a 100-year, something beyond a 100-year event. And additionally, we need to look at those 500 and 1,000-year hydrology studies and mapping to maybe expand these boundaries and to start looking at and analyzing if these are going to become more frequent, and they are, then where is that at? And can we inform people of that? And then how can we do, context-based, location-based solutions for that? And so those are kind of some of the things we can kind of look at, which is always hard in our rural communities. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn the finger off of my phone. But yeah, so these are kind of things to think about. They're not exactly specific as, kind of Jenny was getting into, so there's general best practices, but these are some of the challenges we got to think about in the socioeconomically distressed or rural communities and how we can begin approaching to solve them. Planning and regulation is not really popular in these areas, but it's something that we need to start talking with communities about so we can support these residents and take care of them and keep them safe and well, and try to plan for a better future here in our areas. So with that, I'm going to stop my slides and I guess we're going to discuss real quick with Jenny and I, perhaps And yeah, I was really kind of curious about that as well, Jenny. Like you talked real quick about, how the insurance premium issues, especially, and even in like I was looking at that and saw those maps with the even not just the coastal regions, but even into Central Appalachia, we can see it's increasing. And as I was just talking about, there's even a lack of regulatory kind of things placing further burden on many of those institutions. So I wonder kind of how that looks like. With some of our communities, the rates are actually lower because we at least have a modest standard of regulation. So here in our urbanized areas, is that kind of what you think that's generally true across the board as well? There's kind of that good balance of the state regulations that then are adopted by these local communities, and that does help and can be beneficial. Is that generally true?
Yeah, I mean, how states have been handling insurance really varies a lot. And some of the hardest hit states, so places like Louisiana and Florida and California that have had really, really costly disasters and major payouts, are struggling to try to keep insurers in the state. And we know that often there's sort of a resistance by the insurance commissioner to allow the premiums and the rates to go up to a point that people can't pay for them. But what we've seen in both California and Florida is that when the insurance companies have these sort of year after year after year very costly events and their payouts are greater than the amounts they're taking in, at some point the insurance company decides it's just not worth it to offer a plan here at all, and they leave. And that leaves people unambiguously worse off. And then the state winds up being the insurer of first resort instead of the insurer of last resort, which state finances are just not meant for that. So there's this sort of kind of delicate exercise. And typically what happens is that the lower risk parts of the state are paying higher premiums than they really should based on their risk in order to subsidize rates for the higher risk place. But we see such strong correlation of risks within states that insurance companies can't really balance that out. So there's been actually some academic research that shows that the big national insurance companies are now balancing risk across states. So, Allstate or Nationwide might be charging lower rates than they really want to in the whole state of California, and then raising rates in lower risk states across the rest of the country. So one way or another, we are going to pay for this. There are also sort of differences in what your primary risk is and how much of that is covered in private insurance. So flood insurance, of course, is provided through the federal government, the National Flood Insurance Program. Flood damage is excluded from homeowners insurance policies, so it's essentially out of that. But fire insurance is covered by primary property insurance, not by the public sector. There have been some conversations in DC about creating a national wind pool, sort of like the flood pool, because the wind events are so costly and they hit an entire state. And so whether wind and fire in particular might wind up with some sort of a national backstop has been on the table. It's going to cost money. Not 100% sure that Congress has the appetite for spending the money on that. So stay tuned. But these are real problems, right? And it's not even just a state-specific issue. How we balance the risk and the payouts for these enormously expensive disasters, and they're storm events that cut across multiple states at the same time. And so thinking about these as sort of having artificial boundaries doesn't work for the insurance companies either. Shae, I was curious, as you were sort of talking about, how your community is dealing with the immediate aftermath of the flooding. One issue that always comes up is sort of how do you do temporary housing while you're doing the long-term rebuilding? And I know this is an issue is sort of, can you get something up and running? Rural areas may not have, empty apartments or hotels or sort of existing unharmed housing that's nearby that you can move people into while you rebuild. How do you all think about that, the short term and the long term?
With this flood, especially, we just had here in Fairmont and our surrounding suburbs, if you can believe me that they are suburbs, but we do have these municipalities. This one was very challenging, especially because we had dozens of, in an area of only 55,000 people in our county, And we had dozens of people instantaneously unhoused as a result of this flood, multiple single-family home collapses, that large apartment collapse. There's 2 adjacent apartment buildings that were also severely damaged. So we had to work with a whole network of folks, and that was us coming together as a coalition with the Office of Emergency Management here in the county. And we coordinated with our housing authority. We coordinated with the local hotels that are outside of city limits. So that's difficult. And then we're looking at transit authority. How can we get these people from the hotels back into the city if they have jobs here or if they need to go to the hospital and so forth? As well as bringing together the other kind of nonprofit assistance providers like United Way here in the Tiger Valley region, as well as we have several others kind of locally to help families and lower income households. And it really took a very large collaborative effort to identify every available unit as quickly as we could and house folks in there. One of the other things we were blessed with is also working with landowners, so directly with people who own rental companies and reaching out to them and collaborating. We do have a rental registry in our city. So with that, there is actually an existing list of these companies, despite us being a rural area. So we were able to immediately use that contact list and go down through and in collaboration with the Housing Authority in United Way, work as quickly as possible to rehouse these folks. The other thing that we often do, and luckily we do good planning on this, is we locate our larger public facilities, our National Guard armories, our schools, usually, and higher elevation, lower risk areas. You know, we do that assessment on civic infrastructure. And this does allow us to also use those spaces for temporary housing or disaster relief. We were also very lucky with that. One of the nearby facilities, that apartment building collapsed on Locust Avenue, across the street's university. The university opened up their student center and turned that into temporary housing for day 1. Day 2, they got a dorm facility ready and put folks in there. And a dorm is not the same as a house. And then we continued the transition to find them new permanent housing or get them into a hotel and to try to get to normalcy as quickly as I could. And so those are often, that's the approach we just took. And that's the way we've handled it. And even in the other floods as well, that I personally responded to the 2016 flood here in West Virginia, down in Greenbrier County. And so we were doing a lot of that down there as well, especially because we didn't know with many of those homes, and we had a lot higher number of people dislocated there, that they may not ever be able to rebuild on their property. So we really had to do a lot of hard work to not only house them temporarily because of the hundreds of people displaced, but additionally do new permanent housing. And that became a multi-year effort with the state becoming involved at that scale to help support that. So I think, and this is where communities are great. Let's collaborate, bring folks to the table and work, especially in rural areas, to help solve these problems at our scales that we need to. Because it's not just as simple as finding an empty apartment. The transportation is an issue because we have almost no public transit. That's statewide. So you really have to be very considerate on these efforts as well. The reason the public transit comes into account is with that, most people own an automobile and they rely on their personal car. And many of these homeowners lost their personal vehicles. And so that was something we also had to consider as the first several weeks of them getting back on their feet.
Yeah, and I noticed that one of the questions that came in the Q&A is asking about sort of the coalitions that are getting built. And I know that particularly in the wake of the hurricanes from last fall, North Carolina has been thinking a lot about this. And, you know, Western North Carolina has a lot of quite small communities that internally don't have a lot of staff, just don't have that many staff and don't have staff who have kind of specialized expertise in everything from grant writing to get access to the federal and state funds, engineering expertise for the rebuilding, these sort of emergency management, sort of standing up temporary systems of transportation to get people back and forth. So North Carolina has really been bringing everybody to the table. The governor's office, GROW, the Governor's Office of Recovery of Western North Carolina, has been coordinating and working with really everybody who's at the table. So it's the individual cities and counties, the North Carolina Association of Counties and Association of Cities, the regional councils of government, UNC Chapel Hill School of Government has been helping coordinate. And one of the things that they told me has been really helpful is that they have a lot of relationships that were there in place before the disaster, where they're providing technical assistance, where they're collaborating. And so already having those relationships built before you need to call on them has been really helpful. They still have to bring in, for instance, technical engineering expertise to rebuild roads from outside, but they're also trying to think very strategically, not just about bringing in consultants from outside to work there temporarily, but how do you start building up that capacity among your local governments and people who are going to stay in those communities, so that if you have something that comes up again, you have the people, you have the expertise, you have the relationships, you have backup plans in place. And nobody likes to think about disasters in advance. It's sort of human nature to think this isn't going to happen to me. But a little bit of advanced planning, and particularly sort of having some systems in place that can be activated rather than building it from scratch in the worst possible conditions, is going to be really helpful.
And it looks like we do have a couple other questions that have come in the chat. Thank you, Jenny, for addressing Nick Rogers' question about that coalition building. Sort of touches on some topics that have already been discussed by you both, but if you want to elaborate a little bit more, Jennifer Harris asks, any state or local colleges, universities involved in supporting data education on approaches or plan development in West Virginia? So I know you'd mentioned, universities stepping up for like, immediate housing needs. But if you have anything to add in regards to data collection, that would be helpful.
Yeah, data is always really difficult here in Central Appalachia generally, in our rural communities in the country. So that anytime we ask for federal grants or anything, and they're like, well, you need to provide data on this. And we're like, oh, besides going door to door, we're not sure how to get it. It doesn't exist. So luckily, there are some of our universities, especially our research institutions, and here in West Virginia specifically, we have Marshall University down in Huntington, as well as WVU in Morgantown. And both of those do a great amount of research and data collection as well. The state itself is actually getting better about GIS data and sharing that. Our Floodplain Managers Association has worked with the state to get LiDAR data that we can supply for free to everybody, along with property data, building structures, infrastructure, and so forth. And so a lot of that's going out there, but then actually collecting, say, things like climate and weather related events. Some of our universities are doing that more often now, and also looking at the impacts of those or other things related to this, housing data, and so forth. With WVU especially, they actually have in their law clinic the Sustainable Development and Land Use clinic within it. And that clinic actually helps write comprehensive and strategic planning for our communities across the state, and often do it for free. And so that is a wonderful resource that's out there. Then collaborating with the rest of our, educational providers and the information they have available in the state to be able to make great plans for these communities to address their issues. And so if your state doesn't have that type of a law clinic, that type of service, but you have rural environments that need support, a model like that is something I would also strongly recommend, because they're going to learn lessons over and over again and share that institutional knowledge across your whole region.
Yeah, and I will say that the Mid-Atlantic region has lots of fantastic universities. And your land-grant universities that have extension services can or should be providing a lot of these services. We tended to think about the land grants and extension as being primarily for agriculture, but this is really just a way to expand resources to communities. Last year, I was visiting with some folks at Iowa State University, which is the land grant in Iowa, and they have a planning department that actually goes out to a lot of the rural communities and provides exactly this kind of assistance in doing things like comprehensive land use plannings and rewrites of codes, and providing supplements, particularly for smaller communities that may not have a full-time planning staff. And so providing this information and being really a resource. We've talked a bunch today about the need for sort of collaborating with your neighbors on information sharing, on planning, on response in the current moment. And so a lot of the universities can be just good places for people to get together. They're great at doing convenings and sharing information proactively, but also about being sort of a first touch if you have a question. Universities have better budgets to buy data and have good computing systems and GIS resources. And often what's needed with these sort of large data sets with climate risk is somebody to put this into a map and translate it from this sort of giant data set into a physical map that you can take out and overlay other things like where are your schools, where are your dorm facilities and your temporary housing in advance, and where are your roads that are at higher risk. And so that kind of GIS expertise is something that you can usually find in your planning department or your engineering departments.
Thank you both. And that was a commonly asked question specifically about GIS data. Another question that had come in from Justin Sanders, who's on our board. Justin asks, on the political front, any recommendations for beginning conversations around resilience when, quote, climate change is a trigger phase for many more conservative elected officials? In rural communities, this becomes more of an issue when proactively planning for resilience, whereas response after an event is less polarizing.
It's a really important question because we all need to be able to have honest conversations about what to do in advance. Naming the disasters by what they are, right? So flood preparation. I mean, this is not new, right? And talking about hurricanes in Florida and talking about even things like sea level rise, which can be controversial if you sort of link it to human activity. But the folks who are in Norfolk, if any of you are on the call, I mean, this is something that y'all have been dealing with for a long time. And, it's hard to avoid the realities when you're staring at them. So I think, getting away from the language of climate change and talking about specific kinds of weather events, specific kinds of disaster events, and talking in very practical terms. What does this mean? What do you need to do in preparation for it? For sure, all of the areas in the Mid-Atlantic are familiar with extreme heat. Whether you want to argue about heat getting worse over time, people are running their air conditioning and you got to pay for that. And that has impacts on the grid. And so the sort of practical steps I find are less controversial. And certainly in the resilience space, that's really what we're talking about. What do we need to do to make our homes and communities safer and healthier and more resilient over time?
I
Go ahead.
Exactly what Jenny said. I mean, and really, I think actually a practical conversation does work better in rural communities because with these communities often they're adjacent to each other, they know each other, and so when there is a disaster, they respond, right? And that's regionally. We'll see like with the the unfortunate events in like North Carolina and northern Georgia, or even in eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia. We see people across the region come in, even not from Appalachia, right? Even from more eastern parts of Virginia and northeastern Pennsylvania, they'll come in and help out. And they remember these communities, they remember these events, and they remember each other. But even on the local scale, going from one county to the next to support each other. And so luckily that helps to really ground those conversations, and folks, they don't forget these events. Being a little bit younger, we did the worst flood we faced here was the flood of 1985, where we had a hurricane come over and get stuck right over our region. And it was absolutely devastating. We had whole communities in north central West Virginia taken off the map, like Rollsburg, West Virginia, and flooding at scales we had never seen before with our rivers that normally we were very safe from here in the northern part. But so that lasts in the memory, and folks don't forget that, and they cling on to that. And so even for these modern events, and so that does help to really ground that. People are like, oh yeah, I remember what happened in Caldwell. I know what's going on in White Sulphur Springs. What can we do for these? They really do care about each other, and they care about their communities next door and in the region. And so that really helps. You don't have to use, necessarily specific terminology. We can talk about what's happening in that practical way. And I think that really resonates with everybody.
Thank you both. It looks like that's it for the questions that are in the queue at the moment. So I'll just remind folks that we do have some time. If you have any questions that you think of in the next couple of minutes, feel free to drop them. I'll ask Shae and Jenny if they have any final remarks that they'd like to make in the meantime.
We'll give a plug for the APA folks, which is that this is also one of the resources you have for sharing information. And it's fantastic that you have multiple states that are joining together to talk with one another. I know that the state chapters individually do a lot of outreach and a lot of collaboration on this stuff. But the APA at the state level, the regional collaboratives, and the national level are all thinking about this. And to sort of go back to the national perspective, I lived for a number of years in California, which is, certainly facing a lot of extreme risk from wildfires. But every part of the country is thinking about this, is planning for this. And I think the more we can sort of be collaborating and sharing notes, particularly about the sorts of relationships and the sorts of infrastructure to build up in advance, and how to prepare for this stuff. It's one of those scary things that nobody wants to happen to them, but having plans in advance is helpful. And particularly thinking beyond just individual households, right? So in California, they always told us to have your earthquake preparedness kit in your house and in your car, and that's all well and good, but the city overall has to have resources for providing people with shelter, with food, with water, with having plans for this, with having communication strategies for when the cell phone network goes down. And so really, making sure that this is on the radar for your planning staff, for your local elected officials, and that they're aware of the resources that they can call in.
Yeah, and I just want to advocate, especially as we face these climate-related issues and housing in our communities, that, with once again, the rural areas and the areas with lower resources, that we especially collaborate across the professions, everything from our enforcement officials to floodplain to transportation, because this is impacting all of us. And so for us as professional planners to be able to, like in our state, we only have about 40 of us that are, registered with the APA as professional planners. We have 55 counties, so we don't even have a planner per county in that ratio. And so we really do have to reach out to all these other professional organizations and really have these conversations and be supporting each other to make sure that these communities are thinking about long-term planning in this way and climate risk and so forth, and that they're getting the support they need, even though they may not directly have a certified professional planner even in their county at all. So and maybe only even one or two in a region, perhaps in some of these places. So that's something good to kind of keep in mind and to continue to collaborate and reach out that way. Make sure we are also reaching out as professional planners to help make other people aware and spread the word that way. And I think that's something really important as we move forward.
Oh, it looks like we did get a question. A question from Nick Rogers, APA Virginia president-elect. Nick says he's worried that anti-growth, anti-development advocates will use the specter, use the specter of climate change risks to oppose housing development in communities that need more housing. Opponents have used concerns about property values, adequate public service, traffic, parking, congestion to successfully halt housing projects in the past. And this feels like another issue that can get twisted to undermine housing production.
Yeah, happy to take that. I mean, I will say, first of all, that there are people who are in good faith worried about where we're building housing and whether new homes are getting built in areas that have a lot of risk exposure. And there are some people who use this in bad faith because they don't want to see change in their communities or have other sorts of reasons for just blocking development. All of you as planners know this. So part of the difficulty is figuring out, whether there are concrete practical things that you can address, or whether this is just sort of a smokescreen for NIMBYism by another name. It is really important for communities to be thinking in advance about where they want to grow and where they don't want to grow relative to climate risk, and just like, access to your infrastructure. Do you want to be building out in places where you have to build new roads and new water infrastructure, or making use of where you already have that already? And I will say that you probably saw from Shae's maps, the level of climate risk and exposure varies a lot within relatively small distances. So there are, for instance, communities that are on the coastline where the closer you get to the coast, the more you're at risk of direct flooding or direct hit from wind events. And so we're not necessarily talking about we're going to take half of the county off of the table for development. It may be shifting a couple of miles inland or a couple of miles, half a mile to a higher elevation. And so often it's these relatively smaller sort of adjustments we need to make, having the map and being able to plan in advance for sort of, we want to start, moving things higher upland or moving them additional inland, and planning for that in advance and sort of letting people know why they're doing this. They're also just adjustments that you make in what get built, right? So newer homes are generally built under newer building codes to higher both efficiency and resilience standards. And so the newer homes may be safer. Certainly if you're in a floodplain area and you have to get federally backed flood insurance, you're going to be required to build that elevated structure, right? So we're not going to build homes with basements in areas where the basements are going to flood all the time, and making sure that, it's high quality windows, that the roofs are bolted to the walls, providing people with information in advance so they can make these smart decisions. A lot of the danger is really in older homes that were not built to these standards that would be expensive to retrofit. And sort of there's often a tension about sort of the newer homes are safer, the older homes are less safe. Do we try to retrofit them or do we try to relocate people into newer structures or into other areas? And there's not going to be one answer, right? This is going to be on a case-by-case basis, sort of what makes sense. But I think, it's important to recognize this and not pretend that it doesn't exist and it's not a real concern, but also to push back on some of the sort of, we shouldn't be building homes at all. And, the eastern half of the state, like that's just not going to be feasible.
Yeah, I think especially here in this region, that's an even more interesting conversation. We, West Virginia generally sits up on a plateau that sheds down to the Ohio and the Shenandoah and other major rivers. But we actually have an area there on the eastern side of the state, which is our state line of Virginia, that is even a higher plateau in itself. So the Greenbrier County area, Tucker, and parts of Barber County and so forth. Those areas are actually facing housing crisis right now because if you go back and you look at those maps, you actually see that they're more resilient to some of the climate change coming. They have much more mild climates, although much colder because of their elevation, but generally more mild, less flood risk and so forth. But there are also two things that occur over there. One is the large national forest, and so there's very little private land available for development. It's actually usually those old coal towns or coking towns and so forth. So the very small footprints where housing is even possible. And those areas, the natural environment is what makes those areas so important. Dolly Sods, Canaan Valley, Cranberry Glades, and so forth are amazing things to be preserved. And the communities feel the same way about it. But because of, we are actually getting an influx of folks from the Nova region or even western parts of Virginia that are wanting to escape DC and then move in because of remote work. And that's putting a lot of pressure on those housing markets. And so that's a very difficult conversation for those regions, as well as Greenbrier County, which has the no signal zone for the Green Bank telescope. And so that also further limits development and what's possible over there. It's a very unique region to live in. It's not surrounded by the national forest in the same way, but it has other development restrictions that are set forth. And so it's not even necessarily NIMBYism. There is extreme limits in those areas to where development can occur, but yet much higher demand now. And so with that, those conversations, that's where we come in as professional planners, is we really got to have those conversations with the existing folks who already live in those communities and the folks who want to also live there and how we can solve those problems together. It's not as easy, and especially the Potomac Highlands I mentioned around Thomas and Davis, West Virginia, because the buildable areas are usually down off the plateau in the Cheat River and Tigert River valleys, where now you're going to be more prone to the flooding from flash flooding and so forth. So I think that's something to keep in mind. It's always going to be on that regional context, but we do see that happening even here in West Virginia, despite population decline. So it's always going to be that local context and making sure we get all their stakeholders to the table. I also want to say, just for us, one of the things is also the CHODOs and the local financing organizations that just work on local affordable housing. So we have Woodlands Development Group here in that region, which does amazing work, and they will not branch out. They're solely focused on that region for that reason there, to try to preserve housing and quality of life and affordability for the existing residents of those eastern counties.
Thank you. It looks like some of the last couple questions that have come in, one has, I think, fully been answered. I'm not sure, Jenny, if you have anything additional to add. It was asked, one of the strategies that Jenny had mentioned in planning for resilience were updates to building codes. Are there some best practices in other states that can be used as a model for these updates? So I know you mentioned a few, but if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, and I will say that as an economist, I get frustrated that when we do updates to building codes, that they're not either provided with some benefit cost analysis. So there are some resilience investments that are relatively inexpensive, but that provide a lot of safety, and others that are really expensive to do and may not improve the safety that much. And we don't do a great job at providing that. So, concrete example, bolting the roof to the walls of the house to prevent the roof blowing off in a hurricane is actually not that expensive. It's a couple of $1,000s. It makes a huge difference not to lose your roof and then get flooded with water. But there are other things that are considerably more expensive. The wildfire protections are often putting different exterior materials on the outside of the building, and that costs a lot of money. And whereas something like pruning the vegetation around the building so that sparks can't fly and the building catches on fire are cheaper. So there's quite a mixture. And professionally, we don't do a great job at this. How the building codes are designed and updated is a little bit of a smoke-filled backroom mystery. So this is an area where it's probably really worth having some local architects and engineers kind of talk to the local planners and figure out, if we're going to go in an entire neighborhood and sort of try to provide resilience, what are the things that really give you the most bang for their buck? And again, the building codes updates are almost never retroactive. And so it applies to new construction going forward, but really the older homes are often the ones that are most vulnerable. So being very strategic about how the money gets spent is worthwhile.
Thank you. And I think our last question, directed towards Shae, how often, if at all, are FEMA flood maps updated to account for surface mining activities?
That is a great question. And since I am not a floodplain manager, specifically in the southern half of West Virginia, where the majority of surface mining does occur, most of our mining here in North Central is all underground. So very little of it is surface mining. But when you look down at those areas I called attention to, Logan, Mingo, McDowell, Wyoming counties, and so forth, that's where we'll have our surface mining. And that's because of the topography. It truly is extremely challenging to do the underground mining there. Because of the way the coal seams go up and down through those mountains. And so I'm not sure how often they are updated. Majority of those surface mines are elevated well above the flood prone areas in those regions because they do want to stay away from the water table when they're doing that. But before the mines are remediated, it does substantially increase runoff because of the reduction of vegetation and also soils and so forth that can actually help absorb the water runoff. So I am not sure if they do that, but they will update the maps generally in terms of topography and flow area and volume area every few years as new LiDAR data now. Now we're doing purely LiDAR. We used to actually go actually get manual contour data. But this is the great thing about GIS technology and the way these things are changing. I used to be a surveyor, so if you'd have told me 20 years ago that we were going to be using LiDAR to this degree, I'd thought you were crazy. And it's really helping out, and it's making that much better. So it is it's not consistent. And also there's not those considerations for the soil condition changes and vegetation changes, unfortunately, I don't believe. But I wish I had a colleague here that was a floodplain manager in the southern half of the state to see if they actually knew something a little different than what I know. That's my understanding.
Well, thank you. And it looks like that concludes the questions that we have. I will be sending out the email contacts of our speakers if you have any questions. I know Dr. Schuetz is a little bit busy, so has admitted maybe not having the bandwidth to take too many questions, but if you think of anything in the days to come that you wish you had asked today, I know that they're both willing to be a resource when and where they can. Thank you so much, Dr. Schuetz and Shae Strait, for being with us this afternoon. I'm so glad that we were able to get to so many questions, and thank you for sharing your important work and insights. And good luck, Shae, to your community as you handle disaster relief.
Thank you. And it was great to present with you as well, Jenny.
Great to present with you. And thanks you guys for hosting this. It's a fantastic idea.
Goodbye, everybody.